Thank you very much, Hannah, and welcome everyone. Either you have to be 6 feet tall or wear stilettos, I think, behind this platform.
Can you speak into the microphone?
Yes, I'll try. All right, I don't really need to see you. You just have to see the slides, I think. All right, thanks very much, and welcome. Before beginning our presentation, Malcolm and I would particularly like to thank Tom Cochran, Emeritus Professor at Queensland University of Technology, whose insights have really helped to inform our thinking about this topic. How did we get here? Well, other than by public transport. Some of the important contextual factors for what's helped us arrive here today to speak on this topic undoubtedly have to do with the research support environment which characterizes Griffith University, where we work. And some of the issues that we have to face there include the need to look at repository solutions internally, and notice the emphasis on the plural for that. The need to address issues known to many, storage versus repositories, especially around major laboratories. And because Griffith University is a research-intensive, multidisciplinary university, certainly the demand for domain-specific solutions. Involvement with virtual laboratories, as we call them here in Australia. You may know them as science gateways or virtual research environments. And at the international level, for example, Malcolm, as Director of eResearch, being involved with some of the Research Data Alliance working groups, which we've heard about in a number of sessions. At the national level, being involved with projects funded by national entities such as the Australian National Data Service, ANS, and Nectar, the National eResearch Collaborative Tools and Resources. But undoubtedly a very important factor as well has been the close collaboration between staff from Malcolm's area, eResearch, and from library in terms of supporting researchers. So for the past 7 years, I realized the other day, Malcolm and I, along with other Griffith colleagues, we've been writing journal articles and delivering conference papers such as the one today, outlining some of the major initiatives which have arisen from that close collaboration between eResearch and library. And I think not surprisingly, the focus over the past few years from our perspective has been tended to be on research data management. But I hasten to add, always in that context of the broader research life cycle. About 18 months ago, Malcolm posed a question. Not that he talks to himself all the time, you understand, but he said, when research data management is under control, metaphorically speaking, and no longer is the primary focus, what will logically be the next area of focus in terms of supporting researchers? And I think undoubtedly because of his close involvement with virtual laboratories, his answer was research tools. And well, when you think about it, it's pretty hard to generate research without using at least one tool. So a quick scan of the literature certainly confirmed that research tools are very much on the radar from our perspective in Australia internationally as well as nationally. And as a result of brainstorming this topic and this idea with another colleague, Louise Howard, whom some of you may have met, we then have produced 2 journal articles. Now, the first one, which should appear, well, we know how publishers work, we heard about that this morning, it should appear around third quarter this year, as the title indicates, looks at the importance or implications for institutions, particularly universities, in terms of supporting those complex tools which are now used in the research data life cycle. And the second article on Trust Framework, which was published exactly a month ago today, and of course, as you can work out, it appeared before the first article, so that's really fun when you're trying to allude to an article that generated it that of course hasn't yet been published. Again, we heard about that this morning. Thank you, Sir Timothy. And we just thought that this topic, the second one, was a logical segue from the first one. So when the call, so our head was in that space. So when the call came out for papers or submissions for this conference, it didn't take us very long to think, well, tools, wonder what's going on there. And we did some preliminary investigation, and we kind of decided that there was indeed a story to be told. And there are two caveats, other than the third one, I need a glass of water. Is that the first one is that in preparing the presentation for today, we've also actually been drafting a journal article where we're exploring this topic in far more detail than could be presented. And the second caveat, and I'm sorry, with profound apologies to all our reviewers, sorry folks, this presentation is probably actually going to raise more questions than it's going to answer. Undoubtedly, as I did yesterday in the folio workshop. Anyway, moving along. So because of those caveats, what we're really hoping is that we'll have an opportunity, based on this topic, to engage in more in-depth discussions with others, other delegates, other interested delegates, so that we can kind of see other ideas that people have, which will help inform our thinking in terms of going forward, and as much for our own institution as perhaps in general. While today's presentation very much looks at research tools and their relationship to research data repositories, there is an important underlying premise, and that would be that we need to think of the research environment as a research ecosystem. And that's as epitomized in this kind of classic illustration by JISC of the research data life cycle. Because if we're not careful in our own institutions, we may have a tendency to focus on objects, to focus on endpoints, rather than the dynamics of the interrelationships as part of that research ecosystem. And so now Malcolm's going to discuss tools and data repositories as part of this research ecosystem and why tools are such an important impetus for driving innovation in research data architecture.
Thank you, Joanna. So it might be useful at this point just to provide some scope or context around what is an institutional research data repository. And in my experience in at Griffith, research data repositories tend to vary a lot. We've got a number of them that are just collections around a particular object type, in publications is a good example, or it could be microscopy images. And then we've got other examples where and when you're thinking from a workflow point of view, they're the archive. In some cases, they're the endpoint, data's preserved. In other cases, again, using microscopy images, they actually play a role right from the data collection right through the whole system to the archival point. And they have a whole lot of tools and other workflow bits that fit around the repository itself. And we also have repositories that have been built specifically for publishing, and we've also got repositories who have got inbuilt access management systems to handle the layered access to data for some reason, because it's got some sensitive material in there. But from my point of view, if research data is generated as part of the research output within the institution, then all repositories that hold research data, by definition, are institutional research repositories, data repositories, whether they're centrally managed or not. And in Australia, and typically in our situation, most of the faculty-based repositories aren't centrally managed at the moment. So why is it hard to build research data repositories? And I've put a few things up there in the middle, but the two aspects intrigue me, and that's almost a push and pull thing between the need to preserve and the need to reuse data. And if you're going to reuse data, you have to think about what the communities want and how you're going to make that fit for purpose, whereas preservation can be a slightly different thing. You're more about long-term survival. There's some good cataloguing techniques and a whole lot of things to describe it, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily good for particular communities to reuse. And a simple example would be the way you may want to display images or maps or something like that. So you have to give some thought about what those end communities look like. So what's a research tool? Now, interestingly, we spent a long time trying to find a definition, and as Joanna alluded to earlier, it's difficult to think that you could work with research data without a tool somewhere involved. And the one that resonated with us the most was from the Canadian Social Science Humanities, which is broad enough for us to, it takes in most of the things that we think about as a research tool. Now, there's some interesting work, I find it's interesting anyway, from Kramer and Bosman, and they surveyed 15,000 researchers in 2016 and asked them to talk about what tools they used in their research. And their average number is 22 per person. Now, a lot of those are common things like ResearchGate, Microsoft Word, Gmail, email, those sorts of tools. But when you look at it in total, researchers use a lot of tools to get from A to B, and a lot of those are common to everybody, and some are provided by the institution, but there is a lot out there. At the moment, their database is over 600 different tools. What they also did was they broke down the research process into 30 sub-processes and then aggregated that up to 7 phases, if you like. And then they looked at the primary purpose for each tool to work out what function they performed in that research process. And the reason they did that, they were trying to establish where the growth or interest has been in the last couple of years. They also looked at each of the tools to work out when they first came on the scene, or when they were invented, or whatever, published, if you like. So as you can see, there's been a huge growth. There's a bit of a drop-off in the last couple of years because there's a lag effect. So the tools that first come on the scene in 2015 haven't been widely reported yet, and this survey was in 2016. But again, you can see there's that explosion in tools as such. And it's pretty obvious why, well, from my point of view, it's pretty obvious why a lot of tools are being used. There's just the scale of data and the need for researchers to do more and more research in near real-time data. So it's got to move faster and at scale. And the actual projects are getting much larger. So the project teams are larger, they're national, international. So there's a whole lot of tools around collaboration. And similarly, governments all over the world are funding large-scale infrastructure around computation and tool development and workflows to address some of the bigger social problems like climate change or urban development and as such. And on the flip side, down at the lower level, you have a whole lot of software carpentry happening and workshops teaching people how to write code to develop their own tools. So tools are just everywhere at the moment. Now, the other interesting thing that Kramer and Bosman did was for each of the tools, they mapped them against the 30 sub-processes. And their interest was what clusters of tools are being used together to produce workflows. So as an example, if we look at, I just picked MATLAB. This is all available online through their websites. So MATLAB is being used in those sub-processes, and the green spots are the other tools that those people in the survey said they most commonly use together. So MATLAB uses like R, or they like IPython. And the red ones where they definitely didn't use them. So they were trying to, Kramer and Bosman were trying to highlight, or they were interested in how researchers were coupling tools together to perform workflows. And Clifford Lynch, and we've seen this not only in industry, but Clifford Lynch last year said this place is ripe for commercial entities to get in and start building workflows with their products. And Kramer and Bosman went through a couple of the companies, and this is the Digital Science, how they're filling some parts of that workflow. But we're also seeing it in the national investment in some of the science gateways. They're trying to flesh out those workflows to get right from collection to endpoint. And they're looking at ways to couple together existing bits of infrastructure that they've paid for previously, but they're standalone, and they're trying to get them to map together to feed data between. So what's the problem from an institutional perspective? Well, there's lots of tools. Researchers use lots of tools in a workflow, and they use repositories, whether it's your centrally managed one or some other one. The other interesting thing is that the institutions, while they might think they've got governance of data, don't own all parts of the workflow. So if you're going to lift the capability of your researchers and address things like cybersecurity and data quality and provenance, you've got to figure out ways to get data to move fairly seamlessly in a governed sort of way between those tools and workflows to understand, so you can go back from a provenance point of view and say how the data was created. So in this environment, from my point of view at least, is interoperability becomes the key criteria. So the problem itself is, how do you build these ad hoc workflows somewhat to have where interoperability is the core focus that you're trying to address? So what's it all mean? Well, from my point of view, there's no single research repository architecture. I would love one. I would someone give me one and I'll build it, but there isn't one. And we have to recognise that repositories themselves are a part of a larger ecosystem. They're not a standalone thing off to one side or at the end. They're playing an active part in this workflow, and especially from a reuse point of view and interoperability point of view. The other thing is that whatever solutions, not repositories, whatever solutions we develop has to handle multiple classes of data, from open data right through to some of the more sensitive data aspects. So classes of data might be around formats or types or size or around the information security aspect of it, just being able to control that. So how do you handle those different classes of data and solutions? And I guess it comes back to the original thing about thinking about data either at the project level or the laboratory level rather than at the object level. And in some cases it might be more streaming data rather than, an object moving through a system. So just changing the nature of the way we think about research data. So this is the last slide. So as Joanna said, we don't have any answers, but I think the way we've been trying to think about it at least is that we do need to take an institutional approach. It's becoming much easier to provide infrastructure as a service at the bottom layer, storage, and even some fairly straightforward repositories, DSpace, to provide some common infrastructure. There's a whole lot of work that needs to be done around the next layer up, the middle layer, or middleware layer I'll call it. So within the institution there might be things like authentication services, security and security governance. It could also be your development pipelines, making sure that you've adopted some sort of standards, thinking about sustainability of these repositories. So thinking about, if you're going to look at workflow technologies, just pick a couple of good ones rather than 30. And thinking about, from that point of view, to build out the middle layer, and that allows you then to focus on the top layer, if you like, for fit for purpose or domain specific stuff. And it will never be 100%. It's probably, let's get 80% sorted out with that first two layers and make the world a little bit easier. So it's about those standard approaches. And the way to do this is to engage nationally and internationally with your colleagues at our level, because there's a lot happening at the moment. So we've got Australian National Data Service, got Research Data Alliance, OpenAIRE. There's a lot of things going on at the moment we need to keep in touch with, but also with the research communities themselves. So in Australia, there's the TERNS, the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network. So keeping tabs on those communities, if you're in environmental research, will give you a pretty good indicator of what they're doing, because they're doing stuff nationally. So there may not be a need to build your own environmental research data repository if they're thinking about building one nationally. And finally, I think a forgotten piece is the end user communities. We've been building repositories and systems for the researchers that wanted it. If we're going to make more data available to communities, for government planners, for industry, we have to give some thought about who's going to use that, who's the consumers of the data we're going to put in repositories, and think about how they might be used rather than just providing data. So I guess the takeaway for us is rather than think about repositories, because we can't quite figure out what the solution is from a repository point of view, think about it from a point of view in the institution about your major workflows and your tools in use by certain disciplines. And workflows could be a laboratory, but it could also be a research centre. So going into a research centre and seeing what data they're collecting and figuring out a better way just from an information management point of view rather than a data management or research data point of view. But also looking at particular projects, the way if you've got a 3-year project, getting in early and help them design the workflows to capture the data right at source and help them feed it through as best you can. So that's the end of our talk. So we didn't have any questions, but we'd love to have some questions or discussion about what your thoughts are on the topic.
We do have about 5 minutes for questions. Yeah, would you stand up and speak aloud? I don't have a microphone to pass around.
Malcolm, it won't be a helpful question, but something to understand the bar chart that you have, all the trends in tools.
That one?
No, the next one. That's really interesting. So a couple of questions when you're looking at that. Would these tools be tools that you would describe mostly as proprietary tools of one kind or another, or label tools, or would it be possible that in the discovery part of the bar, the red bar, or the analysis part that you're talking about, for example, computationally intensive jobs that have been submitted to an HPC centre, for example?
Did everybody hear the question? Should we repeat it?
So the question was, I think, if the tools, are we talking about commercial tools or open source tools or more?
Would an example be the use of a high performance computing centre to do this work?
I'm going to cast my mind back looking through the database. So the types of tools, besides the obvious ones like ResearchGate and some of those, most of the tools they didn't distinguish between commercial and open source. So R was there right next to SPSS, next to Stata. So, but they were definitely, all the ones I can remember were standalone tools that had used, but there may have been, I think there was a couple of ones that you could, it was a bit hard to separate the tool from the data. It was a service, if you like. So there could have been computation stuff behind it too. So, especially some of the Science Gateway stuff, they were up there as tools, but they were obviously a bit more than that.
Any other questions from the audience?
No answers.
I have a question.
Yes.
I wonder, going back to the other slide, the previous one, and this is rather astounding. Do you think, I wonder if as interdisciplinary research becomes more common, will we start seeing some convergence and that number will go down? And do you think it'll be easier to come up with some general purpose workflows that work across a number of research areas?
I'm not sure it'll go down. Part of it is I think there may be some discipline influences there. But I think it's also depending on what research they're doing. So each research project might involve more tools than the others. So one thing that occurred to me looking at this is if a researcher's casting their mind, filling out the survey, but looking over their last 5 years, they may have done 3 or 4 projects. They may not have used all the tools in each of those projects. They may have used a suite of tools that they keep in their kit that they work with. So I'm not sure it'll get any more or any less. I suspect what might happen in some of the major disciplines, they'll start to bundle some of those together. So we're seeing that in things like if you look at a tool like Qualtrics Survey, so now there's an R connector. They're starting to put hooks between these tools. So I'm not sure it'll get any less. I think we'll see them starting to be a bit more interoperable. In the gateways, we might see just a workflow in future.